Hello everyone and thank you for watching Edupedia World videos. Today in this class we'll start a new chapter, that is chapter 2, Residence and Scope of Total Income. And in that we will be doing today unit 1, that is Residential Status and Scope of Total Income. So let us start with our class today. The learning objectives for this unit are: number 1, to know the relevance and significance of residential status in determining the total income of a person. We get to know that what significance and what relevance the residential status of a person holds in determining the total income of a person. We cannot proceed to calculate the total income and taxable income of any assessee until and unless we determine the residential status of the assessee. So it holds very important relevance and it is very significant in the IT Act. Residential status of an assessee. How it is determined and what is the different type of statuses of an assessee. We'll get to know. Number second learning objective is the types of residential status. What are the different types of residential status and how the assessees are divided among those residential status. What is the criteria of classifying various assessees in the different types of residential status? And number 3, the rules for determining residential status for different categories of person. What are the rules we have to follow in determining the residential status? If those rules are followed, then the assessee will be categorized in particular residential status category. If those rules are not followed, then the assessees will be classified in a different category of residential status. So there are certain rules of residential status. So let us start with today's class, that is the residential status and its significance. The definition of residential status is given under Section 6 of the IT Act 1961. It says that the incidence of tax on any assessee depends upon his residential status under the Act. So until and unless we determine the residential status of the assessee, we cannot calculate the amount of tax payable by him. Rather, we cannot even classify that which income will be chargeable to tax and which income will be not. So the first and foremost step to start with in the calculation of income tax payable by any assessee is the determination of the residential status of that particular assessee. So after determining whether a particular amount is capital or revenue in nature, if the receipt is of revenue nature and chargeable to tax, it has to be seen whether the assessee is liable to tax in respect of that income. Meaning, whenever we start with the calculations of tax payable by any assessee, we first of all see that whether the particular income is capital or revenue in nature. After determining the nature of the income, and if the nature of the income is revenue, then we have to see whether it is chargeable to tax or not. And when it is chargeable to tax, the next step is to see whether the assessee is liable to tax in respect of that income, meaning that whether the residential status of that assessee is such which will make him liable to tax in respect of that income. So for that we have to determine the residential status of him. And after we determine the residential status of him, we will be able to classify that whether in respect of that revenue in nature, the income which is of revenue in nature, that income, in respect of that, the assessee is liable to pay tax or not. So, for the purpose of determining that whether the assessee is liable to tax in respect of that income, we have to determine the residential status of the assessee. The taxability of a particular receipt would thus depend upon not only the nature of the income and the place of its accrual or receipt, but also upon the assessee's residential status. So there are three things which will determine the taxability of a particular receipt. Number one, whether it is revenue or capital in nature. Number two, the place of its accrual and receipt. And number three, the most important, is the assessee's residential status. It may so happen that the income is revenue in nature and it is taxable, but the residential status of the assessee is such which will not make him liable to pay tax in respect of that income. So, the determination of residential status plays a very vital role in determining the income tax payable by any assessee. For all purposes of income tax, taxpayers are classified into three broad categories on the basis of their residential status. So there are three categories of residential status under which the various assessees are classified. And after this classification, their calculation of income tax is started. So this is the first step we have to follow before we start with the calculation of the income tax payable by various assessee, that is, to determine their residential status. The IT Act has classified the residential status into three categories. Number one is resident and ordinarily resident. Number two, resident but not ordinarily resident. And number three, non-resident. So, the liability of tax which is upon us, or the amount of tax which we will be required to pay, will depend upon our residential status. If we are a resident and ordinarily resident, our liability will be different. If I am resident but not ordinarily resident, my liability of tax will be different. And if I am a non-resident, my liability will be different. So, different assessees falling under these different categories of residential status will have different liabilities of tax to be paid by them. So let us start with the various conditions under each category. There are some conditions under resident and ordinarily resident, and some conditions under resident but not ordinarily resident. If these conditions are satisfied and not satisfied, accordingly the assessees are classified, and then accordingly their liability is calculated. So let us first start with the conditions to be satisfied by an assessee to fall under the category of resident and ordinarily resident. Before going through the conditions which are needed to be satisfied by an assessee to fall under the category of resident and ordinarily resident, let us first just go through one point which we need to keep in mind before determining the residential status of any assessee, and that one point is that the residential status of any assessee must be ascertained with reference to each previous year. What does this mean is that a person who is resident and ordinarily resident in one year may become non-resident or resident but not ordinarily resident in another year, or vice versa. So for this reason, we need to determine the residential status of the assessee for each previous year. So if in this year we have determined that an assessee is a resident and ordinarily resident, it does not mean that he'll continue to be so for the coming previous years. This is not the case. We have to determine the residential status of the assessee for each year. Every year we need to just see that the assessee fulfills the conditions of being resident and ordinarily resident. And if he does not, then he may fall into the category of non-resident or resident but not ordinarily resident. So this one point we need to keep in mind, that an assessee, the residential status of an assessee must be ascertained with reference to each previous year. In order to determine whether an assessee is resident and ordinarily resident or resident and not ordinarily resident,
First of all, we have to determine that whether the assessee is a resident in India at all or not. So first of all, we determine that whether the assessee is resident, and then we further determine that whether he is resident and ordinarily resident or resident and not ordinarily resident. So before determining ordinary and not ordinary, we have to first of all determine that whether he is resident in India at all or not. So these are the two conditions given under section 6(1) of the Income Tax Act. The assessee has to fulfill any one of the following conditions in order to be said a resident in India under section 6(1). So what is given is that if he satisfies any one of the following conditions, it is given under section 6(1) that an assessee, an individual, is said to be resident in India in any previous year if he satisfies any one of the following conditions. So it is a or condition, either one or two. If he satisfies any of the two conditions, then he would be a resident in India according to the IT Act. And if he satisfies both the conditions, then well and good. If he is satisfying one condition also, then also he is a resident. But if he is not satisfying any of the two conditions, then he would be categorized as non-resident. So let us see what are the two conditions given. Number one, he has been in India during the previous year for a total period of 182 days or more. We have to see that whether in the previous year, that is the year before this year, he has been in India for a total period of 182 days or more. If he has been in India for 182 days or more in the previous year, then he would be a resident in India. He would be called as a resident in India. This is the first condition. If he is satisfying this condition, then well and good, he is resident. And suppose if he is not satisfying this condition, then we'll see the next condition. What is the next condition? He has been in India during the 4 years immediately preceding the previous year for a total period of 365 days or more, and has been in India for at least 60 days in the previous year. The first condition said that he has to be in India in the previous year, that is the year in which his income will be assessed to tax. If in that year he is in India for 182 days or more, then he is a resident. Suppose he is not fulfilling this condition, then we will see the second condition. The second condition is saying that we have to see that in the 4 years immediately preceding the previous year, that is the year which is under assessment, that is the year the income earned in that year which is being assessed to tax, we have to see 4 years before that year. Suppose we are talking about the previous year 14-15. So we'll see the 4 years immediately preceding the year 14-15. That will be 13-14, 12-13, 11-12 and 10-11. These 4 years will be calculated. The total period of 365 days will be calculated for these 4 years. So if I am being in India for a total period of 365 days or more in these 4 years, then I'll be called a resident. But this second condition containing two conditions. First of all, this 4 years condition, that is I have to be in India for a total period of 365 days in the 4 years immediately preceding the previous year. And also one more condition is there in the second condition. It is that I have to be in India for at least 60 days in the previous year. So the second condition, what does this second condition is saying? This second condition is containing two conditions, and this is and situations. meaning I have to satisfy both these conditions. First of all, I have to be in India for a total period of 365 days in the 4 years immediately preceding the previous year, and just pay attention to this word and means also I have to be in India for at least 60 days in the previous year. Then only I would be called a resident in India. Suppose I am fulfilling this first condition of being in India for 365 days in immediately preceding 4 years, but I am not satisfying this condition of being in India for at least 60 days in the previous year. Then this condition number 2 will not be satisfied, and I will not come under the condition under this section 6.1, and I'll not be called a resident of India. So what we draw from these two conditions is that first of all I have to satisfy either of these two conditions, either one or two. The condition number 1 contains only one clause, but condition number 2 contains two clauses, and I have to satisfy both these clauses to become a resident. If I am not falling under condition 1, that is I am not satisfying the condition of 182 days or more, and if the income tax department is seeing the next condition, then in that next condition I have to fulfill two conditions, that is 365 days and 60 days. So these are the two conditions which is given under section 6.1, which is applied in order to calculate or determine whether any SSC is resident or not. If the individual is satisfying any one of the conditions mentioned above, he is a resident. But if both the above conditions are not satisfied, the individual is a non-resident. As we discussed in the previous slide, that the individual has to satisfy any of the following conditions, either condition 1 of 182 days or condition 2 of 365 and 60 days. If he falls under any of the two conditions, he will be regarded as a resident. But unfortunately, if he is not falling under any of the two conditions, that is, neither he is fulfilling the condition of 182 days nor he is fulfilling the condition of 365 days and 60 days, then he will be regarded as a non-resident. Let us take this example to understand the concept of section 6.1 more clearly. What is the example saying? Roger Federer, the Swiss player, comes to India for 100 days every year. Find out his residential status for the assessment year 2015-16. For the assessment year 15-16, the previous year will be 14-15. So we have to see the number of days for the previous year 14-15. It is saying in the question that he comes to India for 100 days every year. So the first condition given under section 6.1 of 182 days is not satisfied by Roger Federer. So we go to the next condition, whether he is fulfilling the next condition or not. Since he is not fulfilling the first condition, we have to see the next condition. What was the second condition? The second condition was whether he is in India for the period of 365 days or more for the 4 immediately preceding previous year, and whether he has been in India for a period of 60 days in the previous year. Since he is coming to India for 100 days every year, so in the immediately preceding 4 years, he would have been in India for a period of 400 days, that is 100 into 4, 400 days. So the condition of 365 days is satisfied. He has been in India for a period of 365 days or more in the immediately preceding 4 years of the previous year. And the next condition was he has been in India for a period of 60 days in the previous year. Since he had been in India for 100 days in the previous year also, the second condition is also satisfied. Therefore, since he has satisfied the second condition in section 6.1, he is a resident. So now you understand the concept more clearly, how this works. First of all, we see the first condition of 182 days or more in the previous year. And since in this question it is given that he was only for 100 days every year, so this condition does not apply to Roger Federer. So we have to see the second condition because it is given under section 6.1 that he has to satisfy any of the two conditions. If condition 1 is not satisfied, we will see condition 2. So let us go to condition 2 in this question. In condition 2, it is given that he has to be in India for a period of 365 days or more in the last 4 years preceding the previous year. So that is satisfied, and he has to be for a period of 60 days in the previous year. So that is also satisfied. Since both of these clauses of condition 2 is satisfied, he is resident. Though he was not coming under the clause of 182 days, but he is coming under the clause of 365 days and 60 days. So Roger Federer is a resident. Thank you, students. Hope you have found today's class worthy. Today we did the conditions to be satisfied to be said a resident in India, and in the next class we'll be doing the conditions that differentiate between ordinarily resident and not ordinarily resident. So that we'll be doing in the next class. Thank you.